Cupid. Tony Bateman opened his eyes. Then he closed them again, and opened them again, and screamed. At least, he thought he screamed, but maybe not. He was pretty sure he'd screamed, but he couldn't have, or he'd have heard himself. A long shrill wail of abject terror, a scream worthy of Fay Ray clutched in the monkey's fist. But he hadn't heard a thing. In space, he remembered, nobody can hear you scream. Valid point. But in space, there are stars, several of them, and he couldn't see a single one. He couldn't see anything, although his eyes were definitely open, because he prodded the corners of his eyelids with his fingers, just to be sure. Blind and deaf as well. He'd heard of cases like that, and even his intolerably frivolous heart had been wrung with spontaneous pity. But his sense of touch was working, because he'd just prodded his eyelids and he could feel pain. Quite a lot of it, actually. His head hurt, and he felt like he was bruised all over. Well, that was understandable, since the last thing he remembered was getting hit by a quantum torpedo. Oh, balls, he thought. I must be dead. That would account for the not seeing and not hearing, but not the being able to feel, or the pain in his head, knees and ribs. But I must be dead, he rationalised, because there's no way in hell I could have survived a direct hit from a bloody great bomb. He yearned for data, but there didn't seem to be any. I go over, therefore I am. Fair enough, but mere existence isn't everything. He counted his limbs. 2 arms, 2 legs, head. Nothing seemed to be missing. His tie was still around his neck. The souls of the dead don't wear ties, not even the souls of dead accountants. And if I'm not dead, I must be. He closed his eyes. It made no difference, but it was what he did when he wanted to concentrate. Now then, let's start by assembling the facts. Facts, get filling. Thank you. I can feel my body, but I can't see or hear anything. Right, so how do seeing and hearing work? Hearing is the eardrums picking up sound waves. Seeing is the retina analysing reflected photons. Touch and sensation come from nerve endings bumping into things. In this case, bits of me. But we've already established that I exist, so no surprise there. Photons and sound waves, on the other hand, come from outside. He suddenly felt as though he'd swallowed a cannonball. I can feel, but I can't see or hear. I can feel me because I exist, but I can't see or hear because nothing else exists. Nothing can come from outside because there's no outside for it to come from. Spiffing. Actually, said a voice inside his head, that's not strictly true. Excuse me, he said, or at least he thought he'd said it, but he couldn't hear a dicky bird. Almost right, said the voice, but not quite. It's because you're in the bank. Tony could feel panic creeping in from the shadows around the edge of his mind. Bad enough to be the only existent thing in the universe, but to be the only existent thing in the universe, and crazy as a jaybird. Who are you? He demanded, at what would have been the top of his voice, if only he had one. In what bank? The Bank of the Dead, the voice replied. That's where we are. We, he thought. Plural. Who are you? Ted Sunshine, you half-wit. Who else? Joy flooded Tony's mind like monsoon rain. You're alive, he said. Thank you. No, said the voice, and neither are you. Joy turned off like a light. Sorry, what did you just say? We're dead, replied Mr. Sunshine. What did you expect when you just passed through the epicentre of a black hole? The what? The epicentre, Mr. Sunshine repeated. Of a black hole. You know what a black hole is? Splendid. One of those. The torpedo hit the shield, and because it had way more mass than we did, we got knocked spinning 2,000 light years until the gravitational pull of the black hole caught us and pulled us in, at which point we died. Understandable enough. But you said we're in a bank somewhere? Yes, said Mr. Sunshine. The Bank of the Dead. But you said we died.
Oh, for crying out loud, said Mr. Sunshine. Yes, we died. We were utterly consumed. Even I can't get sucked into the heart of a black hole and get away with it.
But you said,
shut your face,
said Mr. Sunshine, calmly and not unkindly.
While I explained, we died. We're now in the land of the dead.
Oh,
luckily for us,
Mr. Sunshine went on.
The fact that I've been a customer of the bank for a very, very long time means I get certain privileges.
Really?
Oh yes. I get bespoke wealth management advice, preferential credit solutions, a dedicated team working with me to realise my medium and long-term investment objectives, and a free calendar at Christmas. Oh, and eternal life. Well, eternal existence. That's not precisely the same thing.
But you said,
I continue to exist after death,
said Mr. Sunshine,
which is more than most people can say. The downside is, I continue to exist here, which, when you come to think of it, isn't such a good thing as all that.
Where's here?
In the bank,
Mr. Sunshine replied.
The bank is a tiny bubble of existence in the middle of a total and utter void, sort of like an embassy, I guess, or the Vatican. What it means is, in the midst of death I exist. So apparently do you, which implies that you somehow get to share my special status, just because we happen to be together at the time of annihilation, which strikes me as a bit rich, considering you've never done a thing to deserve it. Anyhow, we exist. So does an unimaginably vast amount of money, tucked away somewhere under the counter existential equivalent of a loose floorboard. Apart from us and the money, however, that's it. All in all,
Mr. Sunshine concluded, with a sigh,
I think I was right all along. The only part of the package worth having was the calendar.
A surge of despair burst through the floodgates of Tawny's mind, drowning everything in bleak horror. You mean we're stuck here, he said, like this, forever? We can't even...
It's looking that way,
Mr. Sunshine said.
Mind you, it's not so bad for me. I'm used to it. Well, I was. This is pretty much how it was back in the old days, before the bang. Mind you, we didn't know anything different back then, so it wasn't so bad. We made our own amusements in those days.
Really?
Yep,
said Mr. Sunshine.
We explored unlimited possibilities through the medium of pure thought. We built vast constructs out of unfettered speculation and raised towering reverse pyramids of sequential hypotheses, starting with one theoretical assertion and working our way steadily upwards and outwards until infinity was too small to contain us. In fact, according to some leading authorities in the field, we thought so much we overloaded the infinite and something gave, and that was how the universe started. I'm not sure I believe it, mind you, and I should know because I was there, but I may be wrong. Wouldn't be the first time.
So that's what I'm supposed to do for the rest of eternity, is it? Just lie here and think?
Not at all,
Mr. Sunshine said encouragingly.
You could also twiddle your thumbs. I used to do a lot of that back in the day.
Tawny was glad he couldn't hear himself, because he'd found the noise of his own snivelling distressing.
Thank you, he wailed. Thank you so fucking much, because if I hadn't been with you and your stupid private banking, I'd have been blown to bits or shredded into atoms, and that would have been just fine, compared to being stuck here like this forever and ever. It's just so not fair. What did I ever do?
Let's not go there,
Mr. Sunshine said quietly,
and get a grip, for crying out loud. While there's existence, there's hope.
It's there.
Probably,
Mr. Sunshine said.
Maybe. Maybe not. We'll just have to see, won't we?
It occurred to Tawny that if Mr. Sunshine still existed in the same way that he did, it ought to be possible to find him and smash his face in. He groped around for a bit, but there didn't seem to be anything out there apart from his own outlying limbs. He gave up, There didn't seem to be any point to anything anymore.
Especially, Mr. Sunshine continued, if we can get to my safe deposit box.
Your what?
My safe deposit box,
Mr. Sunshine repeated.
It's a box I keep things in, including, if memory serves, a couple of get-out-of-death-free cards. I think they'd probably do the trick, if only we can lay our sticky paws on them.
The surge of hope was back. It wasn't quite as pristine and pure as it had been the last time. There were little bits of pessimism, cynicism and rage bobbing about on top, and instead of sweeping along like a tsunami, it sort of ebbed cautiously, as though expecting someone to pull the plug at any moment. But it was hope nonetheless. Get out of death-free cards? You're kidding.
Absolutely not. The bank used to hand them out at Christmas for a while, along with the calendar, though they stopped doing it some years ago. I think that was because they only gave them to people they knew would never use them. People like me, you see, practically immortal. But I started giving mine away to chums, and so did some of their other customers, so they soon put a stop to it. But I seem to remember there being a couple left.
That, Tawny decided, was different. That's amazing, he said. You mean we could actually get out of here? Go home even?
I don't see why not, said Mr. Sunshine. But that's assuming we can get to my box, like I said. And of course, I'd need the other key.
The other?
It takes 2 keys to open it. That's the standard procedure. The other key holder's the Assistant Deputy General Manager. We've always got on quite well, all things considered.
What things considered?
It's a funny thing about the bank, Mr. Sunshine said. They're entirely trustworthy as far as money's concerned. Financial integrity's their middle name. When it comes to other things, though, they're as slippery as a fistful of eels. I guess we'll just have to play it by ear and see what happens.
Tawny remembered that he'd been advised to get a grip. Good advice, he decided. For choice, the grip would have been around Mr. Sunshine's neck. But you can't have everything. How do we find your safe deposit box? He asked.
No idea, Mr. Sunshine replied. What I've always done is call ahead to let them know I'm coming, and Charlie would be there to meet me.
Charlie?
The Assistant Deputy General Manager of the bank, said Mr. Sunshine. A flat chap. His granddaughter's a big shot corporate lawyer in Hong Kong.
He's a friend of yours?
I wouldn't go so far as to say that, Mr. Sunshine replied. I don't blame him, of course. It's the way the bank's bonus system's set up. For every human soul they manage to ensnare into staying to the bank before their allotted time is up, they get a nanosecond of life.
You what? A nanosecond?
That's right. A whole nanosecond of self-aware existence. With an incentive like that, you can see how easily professional ethics can get lost down the back of the moral sofa. And the other side of the coin is, if one of the dead stock somehow contrives to get away on their watch, they get 50,000 years suffering the torment of the damned and a formal reprimand. Letting me get to my safe deposit box would almost certainly count as aiding and abetting a fugitive.
But it's your box, and if the bank issued the cards in the first place...
Things are a bit different down here, Mr. Sunshine said. Like I said, where money's concerned, straight as a die. In other respects...
Tawny whimpered. On the one hand, hope. On the other, bleak despair. All things considered, he'd have been okay with either one, just so long as the agonising tug-of-war could be over. But you've got a plan, he said. Tell me you've got a plan.
I've got a plan.
Wonderful, Tony said. What is it?
No idea,
Mr. Sunshine said.
Now please stop talking just for a minute or so and let me think.
Consuela pulled the strong room door until it was almost closed, but not quite, then groped on the wall for a light switch. There didn't seem to be one. Not to worry. She fingered the gold chain around her neck. "Honeyman, you useless ball of fur," she commanded. "Lights." A beam of golden light shone from level within the gap between her collarbones out into the room, which was small and apparently completely empty. That didn't faze her in the least. The best way to hide something is, of course, in plain sight. Next best is hiding it in plain invisibility. "I haven't got time for this," she told the room. "Reveal." She'd got a distinction in revealing spells in college, not as impressive as it sounds, since Sunnyside was one of the more modern thaumaturgical academies, funded by venture capital and obliged to provide its shareholders with the best possible return on their investment. A distinction was 10% extra, payable in advance of the actual coursework. That didn't mean she wasn't good at them. She opened her third eye and peered, and sure enough, shadowy forms began to consolidate around the walls of the room, sets of grey painted angle iron shelving on which sat a modest number of brown cardboard boxes. "Fine," Consuela said to herself. "Let the dog see the rabbit." A hand, hard as iron and strong as death, gripped her left shoulder and spun her round. A figure shimmered into existence an arm's length away from her, and she fought back the urge to scream. "Daddy?" she said.
"No, of course not. Don't be stupid."
Right now her father was either sitting behind his desk contriving a hostile takeover, or out on the golf course spinning his gossamer threads around some client. The reason the creature crushing her shoulder blade looked like Daddy was because Daddy was the one person in the world she was scared stiff of. A security protocol, therefore, and how big a deal could that be? "Prove," hissed the creature, "that you're not a robot." "Oh, don't be so," she started to say, and then noticed that her shoulder wasn't hurting anymore, even though the creature hadn't relaxed its grip. There was a reason for that. Her shoulder was now a titanium moulding. The creature's voice was as quiet as rats' feet in a dark cellar. "Verify." "I am not a robot," she protested. The words came out in a metallic monotone. Angrily, she activated the plasma cannon built into her left arm and loosed off a volley, which bounced harmlessly off the creature's eyeball. "I appear to be a robot because you have initiated my shape-shifting abilities against my will and caused me to transform into an artificial life form. If you would kindly pack it in, I will prove to you that I am not." Without letting go of her shoulder, which was once again flesh and blood, the creature raised its other hand and tilted her chin round to the left. On the wall opposite, she saw a projection of 9 squares. Each of them appeared to be a pastoral landscape, rolling hillsides, carpeted with verdant grass. "Select all images containing a wizard," snarled the creature. "None of them." "Including wizards with invisibility cloaks." "That's not—" She took a deep breath. She could do this. She strained her third eye until it practically squeaked. In the bottom left-hand square, she could just make out a sort of ripple effect. "Square G," she said. "Well?" The wall went blank. Then 12 different squares appeared. "Oh, come on," she moaned, but the creature didn't seem to be listening. "Select," the creature rasped, "all images containing pain." Well, that shouldn't be too difficult. She looked, then tried desperately to turn away, but the creature's grip wouldn't let her. Herself at preschool, standing alone in a corner. Herself at big school, the last to be chosen for a netball team. Herself, fat and spotty, hovering on the edge of the group clustered around the cool gang. Herself gazing hopelessly at Steve O'Gorman, who was smiling at somebody else. Herself at the Freshers' Fair. "Bastard," she said. "All of them." The wall went blank. 12 more squares appeared. "Select all images," whispered the creature in a voice loaded with malicious glee, "containing love." "Get stuffed." "Select all images." "All right," she snapped and faced the wall. 9 pictures of Brian Teasdale at the beach, sitting outside a pavement cafe, up a stepladder, painting a wall, soaked to the skin by a sudden squall of rain. "None of them!" she shouted. "Not in a million years! Not if the future of sentient life depended on it!" Her shoulder creaked under the pressure of the creature's fingers. Even titanium can only stand so much pressure.
"I am not a robot,"
she tried to yell, but it came out in Dalek speak.
"I have no feeling whatsoever for that fat-headed, gutless, incredibly boring—"
The creature nestled closer and whispered into her tin ear. "Prove you're not a robot."
"How would it be if I told you my mother's maiden name and the name of my first pet?"
"Verify."
"None of them,"
she blared, then looked again. "Well," she mumbled, "maybe Square D. He does look kind of cute with his hair all wet." The creature relaxed its grip. If it hadn't, it'd have squished her shoulder into a bloody pulp. The wall went blank. Then 3 more squares appeared. "Oh, for crying out loud," Consuela said. "Aren't we done yet?" "Select all squares." The creature's voice was soft and far away, like the wind sighing through a fleshless ribcage. "Containing absolution." Oh, that old thing. She considered the squares. Only 3 this time. Absolution. What a funny thing to ask about. In the first square, she was sitting in an office. It was a big office, with a huge window, through which she looked down on the London Eye. The viewpoint changed, and she saw at the edge of her vision a sheet of headed notepaper. There was a big JWW logo, and under it a list of names. The first name on the list was Consuela Teasdale, followed by CEO. In the second square, she was sitting in a very different sort of room. The ceiling was low. The wall nearest to her was panelled in centuries-old oak. The other walls were floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, crammed with a complete series of learned journals. She was sitting in a big, comfortable armchair, and opposite her perched a terrified-looking young woman with a laptop on her knees, reading out an essay. On a nearby coffee table was an off-print of a scholarly paper. Born 3, The Case for Trinities Proven, by Professor C. Teasdale. In the third square, she was sitting at a narrow desk in a crowded room, peering at a computer screen and wearing headphones. A faint buzzing noise. "Hello," she heard herself say. "Welcome to Picosoft Technical Support. How can I help you?" Short pause. Then she heard herself say, "Well, first of all, I'd like you to turn off your computer for me and then turn it on again." Consuela twisted around. Regardless of the pain and the collateral damage, the creature was staring at her. "You've got to be kidding," she said. "Seriously?" The creature's hand twisted her head back to face the wall. The squares had gone. Instead, there was one big square in which a blue-green planet floated against a velvet starry backdrop. A brilliant flash of white light hurtled towards it at great speed and rammed into it. A cloud of steam, mushroom-shaped, rose up from the point of impact. Then gradually, the planet began to come apart, like a swarm of bees dissipated by a gust of wind. One moment it was a sphere, perfect in its symmetry. The next it was just chunks and bits and a cloud of dust, with stars peeping through the gaps. Consuela had stopped noticing the pain in her shoulder. "Seriously?" she said. "Seriously," said the creature. The 3 squares were back. "This is so unfair," Consuela said. "Why me? What did I ever do?" "What did you ever do?" echoed the creature. "Verify. Select all squares containing absolution." In a very small voice, Consuela said, "Square C, But that's really mean. Why not Brian, for pity's sake? Or Ted bloody Sunshine? It's because I'm a woman, isn't it? You wouldn't be picking on me like this if I was a... She stopped herself. Seriously, because none of them could have done it. Continue. The wall went blank. The creature wasn't there anymore. Her shoulder was fine. Screw you! She shouted into the empty room. And you can't hold me to it. I didn't sign anything. A mirror appeared in front of her. It can't have been an ordinary mirror, because by the time it appeared she had stopped shouting, but in the mirror she could see herself yelling into thin air. Fine, she sighed, but is that really the reason? Because none of them could have done it, only me. She saw her face in the mirror and lip read. None of them could have done it, only me. Oh, she thought. Oh well, just out of interest, why not? What's so special about me? The mirror vanished. A voice in her head, still and small and calm, whispered, "Verification complete." She took a deep breath and let it go slowly. "First thing I'll do, if I ever get out of here," she promised herself, "I'll go round to Zauberwerk and punch somebody's head." A noise startled her. She looked around and saw a pin lying on the floor. It had fallen from one of the shelves of a grey-painted angle iron shelving unit, on which rested a single cardboard box. She realised she wasn't using her third eye. "Oh, I see," she said aloud. "So quiet you could hear a pin." There was only one shelving unit. Before, there'd been half a dozen, and many boxes. Taped to one of the shelves was a brown envelope, on which someone had written in black marker pen, "Silence." Fine. She'd heard about that sort of thing. There are materials so delicate that being repeatedly battered by sound waves damages them. Likewise photons, which was why there was no light switch next to the door. The glow from the little gold monkey around her neck diminished into a dull gleam. No point, she decided, in hanging about. She advanced to the shelving unit, lifted the flaps of the cardboard box, and looked inside. "Oh, come on," she was about to say, but then she caught sight of the notice out of the corner of her eye and didn't. Inside the box was a brass Zippo lighter, a cinema ticket, a packet of Oreos, a rubber band, and a tuning fork. He'd never admit it out loud, but Tom Dawson had a thing about heights. He didn't approve of them on a fundamental level. Come the revolution, in his view, all heights would be lined up against a wall and shot down, in other words, with up. "Are you all right?" Mr. Ahriman asked him. Mr. Ahriman was standing in the peak of a very high mountain. One of the very few in existence actually comes to a point. Anyone who didn't know him might have mistaken him for an angel dancing on the pointy end of a pin. Mr. Dawson, peering out from under the pocket flap of Mr. Ahriman's jacket, made a sort of gurgling noise. "We're here," Mr. Ahriman said. "You can come out now." His hand surged around the sides of Mr. Dawson's head, thumb pressing against the right temple, fingers clamped to the left. His grip tightened and he pulled Mr. Dawson out like a rabbit from a conjurer's hat. Mr. Dawson felt the full weight of gravity in his feet as he dangled from the intolerable grip. Agony if Mr. Ahriman didn't let go. Certain death if he did. A long way below he could see clouds. "It's all right," Mr. Ahriman said. "You're perfectly safe." Mr. Ahriman may have been the father of lies, but he didn't tend to tell them very often, mostly because, coming from him, the truth was vastly more painful. If he told you you were safe, then for the time being you probably were. The grip slackened. Mr. Dawson felt the skin of his temples drawn into moraines by the tips of Mr. Ahriman's fingers as he slid from his grasp. Before he could even yell, the pressure eased completely. He was falling. Mr. Ahriman caught him easily with his other hand. "Oopsie," he said. Butterfingers. He put Mr. Dawson down gently between his feet on the very apex of the mountain. That wasn't really an improvement. Terra firma was Mr. Dawson's favourite thing, but not when it had a point on it like a needle. He managed to jam the point between the sideways curled toes of his feet, which gave him just enough stability. I could, of course, Mr. Ahriman was saying, just go away and leave you here, knowing your silly phobia about high places. That might be a giggle. What do you think? Mr. Dawson knew that if he closed his eyes, he'd lose a tiny scintilla of balance that was keeping him from a very, very long fall. That meant he had to have them open and see where he was.
Not bad, he forced himself to say, but you can do better.
Mr. Ahriman laughed. You're right, he said. I can. What we're here for is just basic orientation, like a sort of preliminary interview, where we get to know each other better and figure out what each of us is looking for in our future working relationship. He sighed, and the faint breeze of his breath was enough to make Mr. Dawson stagger for a moment. Actually, quite pointless, since we know each other very well indeed, don't we? But procedure is procedure, and I've got to fill out the forms and tick the boxes. You know how it is. Right then, shall we get on with it? Up till then, Mr. Dawson had been too preoccupied to notice the cord. It began to assert itself. He couldn't feel his nose or his fingers. More to the point, he could barely feel his feet, the clamping pressure of which was the only thing keeping him from falling.
Might as well, he muttered. Then, could we possibly go somewhere else?
Mr. Ahriman chuckled. Was that a request? Rule 1. Don't ask Mr. Ahriman for anything at all, because of the price tag inevitably attached thereto.
More like a suggestion,
Mr. Dawson said.
A rhetorical one.
Mr. Ahriman patted him on the head, very gently. You still think you're going to negotiate your way out of this, don't you? Bless you. That's so sweet. I'm very sorry, but it's too late for that now. You defaulted on our agreement, and I foreclosed. You're mine, body and soul. Therefore, he added happily, everything that's yours is also mine, so you have absolutely nothing left to negotiate with. He paused, then added, You can despair now, if you like.
Thanks,
Mr. Dawson said.
That'll be a great weight off my mind.
Mr. Ahriman was silent for a moment.
Come again. It's not the despair,
Mr. Dawson quoted.
It's the hope.
Excuse me? Mr. Dawson forced a poor excuse for a laugh.
Really?
He said.
You think you know people, but obviously you don't. Despair doesn't hurt, or at least not much. When you know there's no chance it'll get better, you can just sort of hunker down and suffer enduringly. No, it's hope that really fucks you up, even just the tiniest glimmer of it. If you really wanted to torture someone, you'd give them hope. But I guess you'd need to be human to understand that.
Mr. Dawson, Mr. Ahriman said delightedly, are you trying to play me for a sucker?
Just pointing out a fundamental aspect of human nature,
Mr. Dawson said.
I expect it's in a textbook somewhere, if you want to look it up.
What an extraordinary creature you are, Mr. Ahriman said. Anyway, let's get on, shall we? All right, here goes. Are you hungry?
You what?
Hungry, Mr. Ahriman said. Peckish? deficient in nutrition, just about ready to eat a mule. Are you or aren't you? Mr. Dawson had to think about that one.
It's not exactly at the top of my agenda, but I suppose so, yes.
Fine, Mr. Ahriman said. Turn those stones into bread.
What stones?
Sorry, with you in a tick. A flash of light. Those stones. Mr. Dawson could, of course, turn stones into bread just like that. In the early days of the firm, he'd had a contract with a leading supermarket chain, but it proved to be more trouble than it was worth.
Hang on,
he said.
It's on the tip of my tongue. Right then. Man does not live by bread alone. Besides, I have a gluten allergy.
There was a printed form in Mr. Ahriman's right hand and a biro in his left. He ticked a box. Very good, he said. Now then, you'll like this one. Cast yourself off the mountain top, and flights of angels will catch you and bear you safely to the ground. Mr. Dawson gave him a look.
You know what?
He said.
I'd rather not.
Go on. It'll be fun, I promise you. Scout's honour. Mr. Dawson shuddered.
You,
he said,
were never a scout.
I so was, Mr. Ahriman replied, though where I come from we prefer to call them insurgents. So that's your last word, is it? Think about it. All you have to do is jump, and in 2 shakes of a lamb's tail you'll be down there, safe and sound. You'd like that. You know you would. He had a point. Even so,
I think I'll just stay here for now, if that's all right.
You're the doctor, Mr. Ahriman said. Well, if you pass that one, this one ought to be a stroll in the park, if you'd care to look around you. Mr. Dawson did so. He saw all the kingdoms of the earth, also a long way away, but not as far away as all that. He saw a tiny speck in the sky that could easily be an approaching asteroid.
Done that,
he said.
Well,
all this can be yours, Mr. Ahriman said, if you just fall down and worship me. Mr. Dawson looked at him.
Seriously?
Seriously.
Are you absolutely sure?
Yes. Mr. Dawson hesitated just for a moment.
About the falling down part,
he said. Oh, I see what you mean. In the circumstances, you can skip all that. Feel free to worship standing, if you'd prefer.
Thanks,
said Mr. Dawson.
In that case, praise be and hallelujah, jubilant in excelsis. That's a particularly nice jacket you're wearing, by the way. Where did you get it?
Mr. Ahriman ticked another box. Splendid, he said. Right then, here's your title deeds to all the kingdoms of the earth. If you just sign there, and there, and there, oh yes, and there. Thank you, your majesty, he added, and handed Mr. Dawson a piece of paper. Well, he said, I have to admit, I'm disappointed. I really thought he was smarter than that. Mr. Dawson looked up from the document.
Excuse me?
Oh, come on. All this belongs to you, but you belong to me. And now, just to put the icing on the proverbial cake, you do so willingly. It's childish of me, but I love it when that happens. Mr. Ahriman looked up. He was observing the approaching asteroid. Not, he added, that it happens very often. In fact, this is the first time that old chestnut's actually worked, because everybody else I've tried it on over the past 100,000 years had more sense. Do you realise, he went on, that in all of human history you're my very first worshipper? Mr. Dawson had gone a funny colour.
Get away,
he said. No kidding. And that was a nuisance, because until I managed to get a worshipper, I couldn't be a real god. Particularly awkward under the current circumstances, because only gods are going to be able to get off-world before the big smash and escape. Thank you ever so much. I can honestly say you've been worth every penny I paid for you. Mr. Dawson gazed at him. Really, Mr. Ahriman went on. It's the ultimate win-win situation. I get to carry on living. You get what you always wanted. You know, the money and the power and the real estate. True, you won't have it for very long, and I don't suppose it'll be much use to you teetering up here. But that's really not for me to say, is it? You always wanted to make the big score, hit the jackpot, improve yourself. Well, didn't you?
Yes,
Mr. Dawson said, with just a hint of residual defiance.
Yes, I did.
Quite understandable. You're from Slough, aren't you?
That's right.
Well, you've come a long way from there, no doubt about it. I don't suppose you can even see Slough from here. No, I tell a lie. There it is. That thing, like a soup stain. And nobody ever helped you or gave you a leg up. You did it all yourself, by your own unyielding effort. No silver spoon in your mouth, that's for sure. And look at you now, all the kingdoms of the earth. Mr. Ahriman clicked his tongue. Things may not have turned out exactly the way you planned, but nobody can deny you got stuck in, pulled yourself up by your bootstraps, and really showed 'em back in the old neighbourhood. Mr. Dawson scowled at him.
Thank you,
he said. No worries. Now your last thought can be, I did it my way.
Yes,
said Mr. Dawson.
I did.
Oh, yes, Mr. Ahriman said. You made something of yourself, all right. To be precise, a fool. Adios, amigo. Mr. Ahriman vanished.
Just a minute,
Mr. Dawson said. Mr. Ahriman reappeared. Was there something?
Just to clarify,
Mr. Dawson said.
All this lot is now mine, right?
Yep.
All of it, as far as the eye can see.
Mr. Ahriman smiled. Don't sell yourself short, he said. You're not allowing for the curvature of the earth. A heck of a lot further than the eye can see, as a matter of fact.
Thank you.
Mr. Dawson took a deep breath. Awkward, since his throat and lungs seemed to be filled with something. Felt like cream cheese. But that seemed improbable. More likely it was fear.
And you're saying you've got me because...
Excuse me?
You claim,
Mr. Dawson said,
that I'm yours, body and soul. I'd be grateful if you could just clarify your grounds for saying that.
Mr. Ahriman glared at him. Don't give me that, he said. We both know why. I served you with a notice to repay what you owe me. There was a deadline. The deadline passed. I foreclosed.
When exactly?
Mr. Ahriman glanced at his watch. 3 hours ago.
Right,
said Mr. Dawson.
3 hours ago. Where exactly?
Sorry, I don't think I...
Time,
Mr. Dawson said, trying very hard not to let his voice break up.
Is relative. As in, when it's 9 a.m. in New York, it's 11 p.m. in Sydney, and so on, and so forth. By the way, where are we precisely? I'm guessing the Himalayas because of the altitude, but maybe not that far east.
Mr. Ahriman's face went blank. I can see where you're going with this, he said. It won't wash.
Actually,
Mr. Dawson said,
I think it will. Our agreement was made in London, UK. Over there,
he added, pointing.
Now let's see. If that's Slough, that's Paris. So must be Athens, and over there is presumably Jeddah. What was the deadline in that foreclosure notice of yours? 12 noon on the 16th.
He squeezed his numb face into a smile.
It isn't 12 noon yet. Not where we are now.
Mr. Ahriman licked his lips. It was when I served it.
That's as may be,
Mr. Dawson said.
But it isn't now, or rather, here. Here, I've still got time to pay you what I owe you, and by an extraordinary coincidence, I've just come into some money. Thanks for that, by the way. Oh, and praise be and hallelujah, I'm quite sincere about the worship, by the way. I ought to be. You've just answered all of my prayers."
Mr. Ahriman was doing mental arithmetic.
"You think you're so clever,"
he said. Mr. Dawson nodded.
"So clever, yes. Clever, no. Actually, I'm incredibly stupid, or I'd never got mixed up with you in the first place. But so clever, yes, I take it," he added. "That so clever means thick as a brick, but nonetheless cleverer than you."
Mr. Ahriman gave him a look you could have stored mammoths in.
"By my calculations," he said, "all the kingdoms of the earth at current market valuation, and bearing in mind the fact that they're about to get splattered by an asteroid, are worth precisely nothing. Think again."
"Fair enough,"
Mr. Dawson replied.
"But that includes all the cash money in all the banks and all the kingdoms of the earth, which is lawful tender and therefore not susceptible to fluctuations in market value, and it's mine, and I'm giving it to you. Not enough to pay off the principal of the loan, but I think you'll find it covers the interest, and according to our agreement—"
Mr. Ahriman was perfectly still and silent for maybe 3 seconds. Then he grinned.
"You know what?" he said. "I think I'll let you have that one. I mean to say, there's bound to be a fallacy in your argument somewhere, because you're an idiot, and always have been. But all things considered, I'm reluctant to let you off so lightly. I thought I'd finished with you, but maybe I haven't after all."
Mr. Dawson shook his head. It wasn't easy, because the cord had reached the tendons of his neck, but he made the effort.
"You bet your life you haven't,"
he said.
"You said it yourself, just now. In order to get off this planet before it's destroyed, you need a worshipper. You need me."
He allowed himself a grin as a special treat.
"I hadn't realized it until you told me just now, and you were saying I had nothing left to negotiate with."
Mr. Ahriman glanced up at the asteroid. It was too far away for any device made by human hands to observe, but he could see it as clear as anything.
"Sorry," he said, "but I think I've lost track. Am I the one manipulating you, or is it the other way around?"
6 of one and half a dozen of the other,"
Mr. Dawson said generously.
"Which is, after all, what negotiation is all about. Rule number 1 of free collective bargaining. If you aim to bring the other guy to his knees and scalp him, first give him what he really wants. The art of the deal lies in the instant of perfect symmetry, when you're screwing and being screwed at precisely the same moment."
Mr. Ahriman looked up again and sighed.
"In that case," he said, "it's a deal. In payment of accrued arrears of interest, I accept all the kingdoms of the earth, except," he added, "Slough. Slough you can keep. You deserve it."
"Thank you. Got a pen?"
Mr. Ahriman lent him one, and Mr. Dawson quickly endorsed the title deeds back to Mr. Ahriman and handed them over.
"Thanks,"
Mr. Dawson said.
"It's a pleasure doing business with you."
"For a moment you made me believe you really mean that."
"Oh, I do,"
Mr. Dawson said.
"It's making the deal that does it for me. Always has been."
They looked at each other with something approaching respect. Approaching in the same sense that the asteroid was approaching the planet.
"Well," Mr. Ahriman said, "so long. The next interest payment's due in a month. Don't be late."
Mr. Dawson shot a quick glance at his feet, still clenched to the apex of the mountain.
"Just a moment,"
he said.
"What about—"
"Oh, that."
Mr. Ahriman nodded.
"I'll leave you to find your own way down, if you can. Do take care of yourself. I'd hate anything to happen to you."
"No, please."
"Sorry," Mr. Ahriman said, "but there doesn't seem to be anything in the small print about rescuing you from mountain tops. Tell you what I'll do. To show there's no ill feeling, I'll make it so you don't freeze to death. There."
he added, and Mr. Dawson's feet suddenly exploded in a nightmare of pins and needles. Now, either you can try and climb down the mountain without slipping and falling, or you can stay there for as long as you can possibly cling on and see what happens. Entirely up to you. None of my business. Ciao for now, he added with a smile. It's been a blast. He vanished into thin air, which was the only sort there was at that altitude. Mr. Dawson looked round, and down at his feet. The upper of his left shoe had just started to rip away from the sole. Vexing because he'd paid a great deal of money for those shoes not so long ago. Vexing for other reasons too. How long, he wondered, would it take Mr. Ahriman to get off the planet? About as long, he decided, as it would take the sole of his shoe to pull away from the upper, at which point his precarious grip on the pointy mountain top would give way, and he'd plummet to his... Let's not think about that, shall we? Not until we absolutely have to. Approximately that long, he decided. Clearly, the moment his head hit the distant rocks, the faith in the divinity of Mr. Ahriman that it contained would be dissipated and lost. He had reviewed his options. He could jump right now, thereby thwarting his tormentor before he had a chance to do his flit. Very noble, very righteous, but he wasn't sure he wanted to do that. Thanks all the same. Freezing to death was out, because Mr. Ahriman had generously granted him internal central heating, because it'd spoil everything if he flew solid and died too soon. He could stay where he was, hoping that someone, or something, would swoop in and rescue him in the nick of time, and let the bastard get away. Or he could simply stop believing. No, he couldn't do that. Blessed are those who have seen and yet have not believed. But Mr. Dawson had seen, and he lacked the mental flexibility to deny an incontrovertible fact, except where the Inland Revenue were concerned. He loathed Mr. Ahriman with every fibre of his being, always had, if truth be told, but that didn't mean he didn't believe in him. An unpleasant thought struck him. When he'd first met him, Mr. Ahriman had been a shadowy sort of figure, more a whisper coming from the shadows in the corner of the room than a physical presence. It was only after the money had changed hands and the agreement had been signed, and Mr. Dawson had condemned himself to the path that had led him, inevitably in hindsight, to this inconveniently pointy spot, that he'd gradually become a recognisable person, with a face and a nose and hair growing out of his ears. Only it slowly dawned on Mr. Dawson. Once I decided he could deliver on what he was promising. Only once I started to believe. So, if I hadn't allowed him to convince me all those years ago, it looks rather as if he'd never have become what he is now, an all-powerful entity, to all intents and purposes, a god. So if you care to look at it from that perspective...
I did it to myself.
There's nothing like realising how colossally stupid you've been to dissolve the soul like a slug in a pot of salt. For crying out loud, he thought, talk about your half-wits. A tiny light flicked on inside Mr. Dawson's mind.
Half-wit? Half as in 50%. Dawson, Ahriman, and Dawson.
He allowed himself the tiniest grin imaginable. I hope you enjoyed listening to this chapter of the 8 Reindeer of the Apocalypse. Please give me a follow, click the like button, share, hit that notifications bell. It really does help the channel and it makes it all worthwhile. We've got another couple of chapters to go. This was Cupid and your next chapter is Donna, which will be out in a couple of days. So have a lovely evening. I hope you enjoy listening to this one, and don't forget, hit that notifications bell and subscribe if you can. Stay safe. Appreciate you.